Right guys, welcome to this video today. In this one I'm going to be covering the topic of relaxation in striking and the importance of remaining relaxed throughout your training sessions. Now, developing effective striking is something that's a very broad topic, and I think people are often looking for these kind of like one-size-fits-all answers, like if I do this certain drill then it's going to make me faster. And that will give a little bit of a boost, but there's many other factors that go into developing these striking techniques. Now, in striking, remaining relaxed is one of the most important things you can do, and I understand how that seems very almost paradoxical in a sense, because when you see somebody moving very explosively, it's kind of hectic, like they're moving really fast and you can see their like muscles tensing and stuff like that. But when you've got a lot of experience in striking, the places where you tense the muscles in order to execute that strike and sort of initiate the body into movement are very, very small, and they happen at very specific times as well. Now, when somebody starts in martial arts and they're not very experienced, they'll be very tense in their body, and that's because they're sort of putting themselves into these unfamiliar positions in their movements. Now, you absolutely can strike with tense muscles. You can do that and it is still effective, but if you think about a car with a handbrake on, you know, when you pull the handbrake up, you can still drive that car, but it feels very slow and heavy and it's absolutely not efficient. Then, you know, if you imagine just removing that handbrake, how easy the car would move. That's basically what happens when you learn to relax your body. So when you start out, you're going to be very tense and clunky. Don't worry about this, it's just a part of learning. And then as you get into that relaxation, it's akin to removing that handbrake so that your body can just naturally flow into those positions very easily. Now, coming back to that paradoxical nature of relaxation in striking once again, it certainly doesn't mean that you are lacking intensity or intent behind your movements. It's about finding a nice balance between remaining relaxed, then using the muscles when you need to use them, and then coming back to that relaxation point again, all while sort of remaining nice and alert and focused in your training. So in this video, I'm going to be speaking about relaxation as it applies specifically to striking, and I'm going to give practical demonstrations of this. And I'm also going to be speaking about relaxation generally as it applies to us as a whole being. And these two seem kind of a little bit different, but they're actually quite indistinguishable from each other. If you're relatively uptight and tense, just kind of in your walking everyday life, that means you've got excessive mental activity going on. And when you've got that, it's like there's no room for your sort of intuitive sense of your body, which you need for this skill. Creativity is something that comes from relaxation rather than being all sort of hyped up and fast. Like, we've gotten this a little bit backwards in today's society, where creativity has become synonymous with the hustle culture and like being caffeinated and just sort of zooming around all the time. But creativity comes from a higher place than intellectuality. It comes from somewhere intuitive, and so that's why you need to be relaxed in order to tap into that resource. Now, what does this have to do with striking then, you might be asking? Why am I banging on about creativity in a video about punching people? So I know you just want to learn how to knock somebody's head off, right? But the reason that relaxation is so important is that it's something that just goes way beyond the physical that we see. When you're in a relaxed state, your body's much more responsive and you'll be able to react to your opponent's movements much more easily and effortlessly. And this is usually why when you start sparring, usually the first couple of rounds, 2 to 3 rounds, are a little bit shit, and you feel a little bit tense, you don't feel like you're really in the flow, and it's only when you get into it and you're sort of forced to relax as you tire a little bit more that it starts to pick up and you get more into that intuitive sense of movement. So what I think is a really good way to kind of develop this sense of general relaxation before we get into the more practical elements as it applies to your striking is to do what's called a body scan meditation. What it essentially is you kind of lie down and then get yourself into a nice relaxed state, and then once you do that, you kind of sense different areas of your body. So you might kind of sense the feeling of your hand, and then what you do in that moment is you tense your hand for like 5 seconds and then you completely relax it. Now, this sounds a little bit kind of hokey and a bit stupid, but it really gets you in touch with kind of the different parts of your body and how they feel and how it feels to tense and relax. Another thing that you can do here is sort of visualize and imagine throwing your strike. So maybe even before you go training, you could set some time aside, maybe 5 minutes, and do an exercise like this. And in this, you basically want to visualize yourself executing the punch with relaxation and precision. And visualizing in this way, kind of this mental rehearsal of your training sessions, is something that can really program you to be able to move that way as it comes to training. So there's many different studies on this and the effectiveness of it, so you can look some of those up if you want, but it's basically like you're just sort of reminding yourself and saturating your mind constantly with that way of doing the technique, so then when it comes to the application of that technique, it just happens effortlessly, and that's really what we want. There's something for me that happens with this where I'm so sort of used to throwing these techniques that sometimes when I'm laid in bed, my mind will start kind of wandering and I'll drift into thoughts, and I'll almost imagine training that I'm throwing a punch, and even just that imagination will activate my arm to move and I kind of jolt myself awake. And this is sort of, I guess, a bit of a negative thing, because if I was trying to sleep, but it just shows the effectiveness of that sort of thought, that mind-muscle connection when you're doing this sort of stuff. So I really recommend that as another exercise in order to develop this as well. So now we're going to get into the practical aspects of this video and how you would actually take that relaxation into your training and when you're throwing strikes. Now the first thing that makes sense to start with is our stance. Whenever I start training, I usually do some shadow boxing and a bit of footwork, and I'll start with an incredibly relaxed stance. So I'm literally just moving around like this. There's barely any tension within the body, just sort of holding myself in an integral position, and I'll move around, maybe practice some footwork and things like this. I'll sort of initiate some strikes, and this is a good way to get used to that sort of baseline state that you want to always return back to after you explode into your strikes. And a lot of these things that I'm going to cover in this section of the video, you will have to be very mindful of when you take them into your training. So you'll notice that you might start out nice and relaxed and you're moving around well, and then as you kind of get into the training and get into that flow, you will forget and you'll start to tense up and go back to your sort of old patterns. So if you do start nice and relaxed and then you start to tense, just let the body go. Often this will happen in the shoulders, and you'll see people's shoulders lift up, especially when they're starting to go a little bit faster. They'll develop that subconscious tension in the shoulders. Just relax the body back down again and come back to this nice relaxed stance. You do see even some pros that are very tense. Like I remember when McGregor fought Dennis Seaver, and Seaver's stance was almost like this, and it was like it's no wonder that he got knocked out so quickly, because he was just very tense and he couldn't let his strikes go. Another part of this is your breathing as well. So you want your breathing to kind of mirror that relaxation. It's no use to be moving around nice and relaxed, but your breathing's like you know, like a tense sort of anxiety type of breathing. You want to keep nice deep breaths. So when I'm moving around, I'll actually breathe very slow, and it's almost in like a meditative way. So I'll move around like this, and I'm just taking these nice slow deep breaths as I'm moving around. I'm really controlling my breath and controlling my body into those movements, practicing that nice relaxation, that movement. Even when I initiate some head movement and defense, for instance, I'm not really tense when I'm doing it. I'm nice and relaxed, and I really advise a good way to get into this, to warm up, is just to start very, very loose and relaxed, not initiating any powerful strikes, which is why I always do that in my sessions. So I've noticed that when I do go too hard and get too excited and I start to hit too hard straight away, say if I feel like I've got a lot of energy when I go into the session, it makes the rest of the session never as good, because there's something about when you initiate that tension early, it's harder to shake off. So I recommend beginning in that nice loose and relaxed state, and then only adding intensity as you go up through your rounds. Now when the time comes obviously to start throwing more intense strikes, we need to be mindful of that relaxation all the way through. And one thing that I do, which has become quite habitual now, in my stance as I'm going to explode into a strike, I will consciously relax my body completely. So it's almost like this moment of pure stillness before all of the movement happens, okay? And I feel that it almost like stores the energy up to then filter into those strikes. And the way I would describe how I use my muscles in this way when I do strike is I'll be completely relaxed here, then I will initiate a bit of muscle tension to get the strike going and to accelerate into the strike. So I'll use that force there, and then obviously I'm turning through the body with that nice technique. I will relax again from here, then almost like maybe about mentally 1 inch before I hit the target, I will tense my body like this. And what that does is it provides a nice stable structure, obviously, for that energy to filter through. So if you hit completely relaxed and floppy, that energy is not going to come into your strike. So you need to be nice and strong and have that integrity of your body in order to let that power go into the strike. But then as soon as I feel that energy go through, I will consciously relax again and snap it back. So you obviously use a bit more muscular force to bring it back, and then I'm completely back into that relaxed state again, and I'm not wasting energy. If I was completely tense and rigid all the way through, I'm using like 10 times more muscle power there, because if I'm only using muscle here, muscle here, muscle here, that's like 3 points of force, right? Rather than all the way through in a constant tension, you're just going to gas out immediately if you do that. And this makes your strikes way less readable as well. So when someone's very tense like this, and you can see them almost like shaking, desperate to get a strike off, you can see it coming a mile off. So when you're nice and relaxed and you're just able to explode like this, that's going to be much less readable to an opponent. Having that subconscious tension in the body, even if you're not able to feel its effects, can impede your movement. So even if you don't realise it, it's probably slowing you down if you're too tense. So one way I like to sort of show this is using this kind of screw shot type punch, because you can see it's quite a long punch and you can see the points of tension. So when I do this, I will tense here to get it out, push my body into it to extend, tense again here, and then relax back in. So I'll do some of those a little bit quicker so you can see the relaxation, and it should look very whippy, right? So like this. As I come in there, yeah? You see how it kind of comes back? It's a little bit like a back fist as I bring it back in, right? And you want to imagine this like, you know when you like whip a towel, you have to be very relaxed when you do that with your arm. If you try and whip a towel with a tense arm like this, it's not going to work. It comes from that whipping motion, right? And I always talk about this in striking videos as well. It's like, it's almost like that energy sort of filters through and then it gains much more power here. So this also adds to your power as well, because if your arm's rigid, it's like hitting somebody with sort of just an iron pole. It's still going to hurt to hit somebody with a pole, right? But when you're relaxed and you allow this energy to all store up through the strike into the final movement, it's like swinging a chain with a pole attached to the end. So that power is going to go up massively as a result of that. Now, another factor that plays into this is obviously practicing good technique and being familiar with how that feels, because if you're not familiar with the techniques and then you're trying to add this sort of subtle relaxation in order to be fast and whippy, it's going to be so much more difficult, because you need to sort of know where you are in the stage of each movement, and through practice, reps again and again and again, you gain this sort of familiarity with your body and you'll know where to relax, okay? Obviously, when I'm, say, turning into this position here, I'm turning my foot, I'm pushing my hips through, and then as I push that shoulder through and then it goes into the strike, I know at each part of this where I need to relax and where I need to be tense. Whereas if I'm not familiar with that technique, it will completely fall apart basically. And I know this becomes a little bit more complicated when you're doing combinations, because then you have to relax, tense, relax, tense, relax, tense, and it all has to become habitual in order to work properly, right? If I'm just doing a jab cross, just to kind of pull back into that position and practice, or even just a cross, one, and back into that position is fine, right? But say if I'm now adding a hook onto that, this is where it falls apart for many people, because they'll be able to relax and just do one shot, for instance, but then when it comes to the hook, they'll sort of forget about this because they're not as used to it, and they might just drop it. So that's why you often see beginners will be mindful of the first part of the technique, then when it comes to doing another one, they'll just throw it out here and this will just go to shit basically, because they've completely forgotten about it. So again, it's going to require a lot of practice, just like anything I teach in these lessons, right? So you need to get used to those subtle tensions, because then when you're throwing longer combinations, in order to be able to extend all the punches and still make them viable, it becomes like this dance of muscular tension and relaxation, tension, relaxation, okay? The difference is, if I'm throwing just a jab cross, it's easy, right? But then if I'm adding a hook on from there, it becomes a lot more complicated, because then I have to contend from here with this tension of the hook as simultaneously with the retraction of this arm as I bring this in, tensing this one here and then retracting it back in as well. So basic technique and practicing those techniques is absolutely imperative for this too. Now the way I'd suggest to develop this is through shadow boxing, very slow and controlled movements as you get used to how it feels, okay? So this is going to be something you have to be mindful of all the time, not so in your head that you can't even think of what you're doing, but just be aware as you're training that this is what you're trying to do, okay? And I would suggest moving slowly with flow, so it's not slow and stilted like this. I'm still completing the techniques in the right timing, but I'm just doing them slowly and fluidly, remaining completely relaxed. You see, I'm still moving through. It looks like my usual techniques that I do, yeah? But I'm just nice and controlled, and I'm really focusing on that relaxation, okay? So practicing shadow boxing, and this is why I always like to warm up with some shadow boxing as well, because even after many years of experience of training, I still like to make sure my body's activated in the right way before I go on to something more intense. The reason this is such a good way of practicing this shadow boxing is because you don't have to worry about the resistance of a target, you don't have to worry about evading an opponent's shots. You can literally practice the technique at its bare bones and just completely concentrate on those things. The more that you do this, there'll become a time where you're just sort of doing this without really thinking, and that's what you want to aim for. It wants to become habitual. So it's almost like your body's remembered that this is how you do something. You know, kind of like when you learn to drive at first, you're very clunky and you're like, oh, where's the gears and stuff like that. But then when you have been doing it a while, you're much more relaxed and you don't even think about it. You can think about something else while you're doing it. And this is the state that you want to aim to get to in your training. But we get there by doing it without resistance, very slow in a controlled environment, okay? Not worrying too much about what we're doing. And lastly, what I'd recommend in this area is that you film yourself training so that you know what you're doing. I always talk about this. Just set your phone up, film yourself going through some of these movements, make sure that you're not moving ridiculously, and it looks somewhat like you think it does, okay? And even when somebody is quite tense, they might still be able to punch, but there's something about it that doesn't quite look right. So you need to train yourself to be able to spot these subtle nuances within your movements and where you're kind of going wrong. And this is still something I do today. Obviously, I do a lot of filming as part of this channel, and there's certain things that I notice and I'm like, oh, I didn't know I was doing that, and it didn't feel like that when I was doing it. So this is something that's really important because it shows yourself moving obviously from like a wide angle, and you can't always tell when you're moving because you're going so fast and intense where you're going wrong. So I really recommend this as well. And another thing you can do is obviously get some feedback from somebody that's got a lot more experience than you, who's quite skilled. Don't just ask anybody because they're not going to have a clue what to tell you, okay? They'll be like, yeah, that looks quite cool, you look really fast, but you might be like this or something, right? So make sure that you ask somebody who knows what they're talking about. And on that note as well, I actually do coaching calls, so if you would like my help personally with this stuff, with my clients we tend to do a lot of sort of technical analysis, like they might send me some clips or show me on the calls some things that they've been working on, and I'll be able to identify things where they're going wrong. So if that's something you'd be interested in getting my personal help, you can book a call in the link below. Thanks very much for watching today, guys. This has been quite a long video, but I wanted to really cover this topic and hit all the points that I felt were important in relaxation, because this is one of the foundational elements that really helps your striking. You can practice all of the, drills, all of the different methods and techniques in the world, but if you're not used to relaxing, then you're never going to get that nice whip that you're probably desiring, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.